Imagine a dramatic tableau unfolding. It is March 1943, and the gaze of Lieutenant James Howard is fixed intently from the confines of his B-17 bomber, soaring at a dizzying altitude of 23,000 feet above the contested skies of occupied France. His dedicated crew had just endured a grueling 8-hour flight, battling the relentless, biting cold of the upper atmosphere and deftly evading the relentless onslaught of German fighter aircraft, all in pursuit of a critical ball-bearing factory situated near Paris. A voice, brimming with an almost defiant confidence, calls out from the bombardier station, "Bombs away!" Yet, a mere 30 seconds later, as Howard peers through his binoculars, a wave of dismay washes over him. Their entire formidable payload, consisting of 12 devastating 500-pound bombs, detonates harmlessly, scattering its destructive energy across a vast, unsuspecting wheat field, a full half-mile distant from their intended, vital target. This isolated incident was far from unique. It was a grim echo of a widespread and deeply troubling pattern. On that particular day, out of the 228 formidable bombers comprising his massive formation, a meager 19 managed to strike anything even remotely approximating their designated objective. This abysmal performance translated into a mere 8% success rate, a figure that, astonishingly, was often considered quite commendable for a mission of such complexity. The unvarnished reality of American strategic bombing during the nascent stages of World War II was utterly merciless, characterized by a brutal inefficiency that few in positions of authority were willing to openly discuss or acknowledge. Meanwhile, in the hallowed halls of Washington, D.C., a starkly different narrative was being spun. High-ranking generals confidently assured Congress that the meticulous precision of daylight bombing operations would unequivocally secure victory in the war. They presented meticulously prepared charts, sophisticated theoretical models, and exuded an unwavering, almost infectious, confidence in their projections. However, across the embattled expanse of Europe, the brave air crews were confronting an unforgiving truth: the monumental difficulty of accurately delivering bombs from an altitude of 4 miles, while simultaneously hurtling through the sky at speeds approaching 180 miles per hour, all under the relentless assault of enemy fighters and the concussive, shrapnel-laden explosions of anti-aircraft flak. These compounding factors rendered genuine bombing accuracy virtually unattainable. The Army Air Forces had meticulously calculated that a circular error probable, CP, of approximately 1,000 feet was indispensable for the effective obliteration of industrial targets. In simpler terms, this meant that at least half of the bombs dropped needed to impact within a 1,000-foot radius of the designated aiming point. This statistical benchmark sounded eminently achievable, yet the grim reality proved otherwise. By the summer of 1943, the actual CP for the 8th Air Force's perilous missions consistently hovered around a staggering 3,200 feet. Disturbingly, some missions fared considerably worse, descending into outright catastrophic inaccuracy. During the inaugural Schweinfurt raid in August 1943, a momentous operation saw Allied bombers unleash a colossal 724 tons of high explosives upon the critical ball-bearing factories, which were known to supply a significant 40% of Germany's entire production. Subsequent post-mission reconnaissance, meticulously analyzing the damage, revealed a disheartening truth: less than 200 tons of that immense ordnance actually struck within the sprawling perimeter of the factory complex. The vast majority of the remaining explosives indiscriminately cratered surrounding residential neighborhoods, scarred agricultural fields, and even inflicted damage upon a venerable medieval church situated a considerable 3 miles away, underscoring the tragic imprecision of the attack. That same day, a devastating 60 bombers were tragically shot down, resulting in the harrowing loss or capture of 600 courageous airmen. Despite this immense sacrifice, the targeted factories, with their vital production lines, were astonishingly restored to full operational capacity within a mere 6 weeks. This grim reality led the beleaguered crews to sarcastically dub their tactic the aluminum cloud approach. The essence of this strategy was brutally simple. Aircraft would fly in rigidly tight formations, with each crew placing their desperate hope in the lead bombardier's navigational prowess. The moment his bombs were released, every other aircraft in the formation would immediately toggle their own payloads. The underlying theoretical premise was that even if individual bombs scattered widely, the sheer, overwhelming volume of ordnance would saturate and ultimately devastate the target. However, German industrial facilities were not sprawling, easily overwhelmed behemoths. A typical synthetic oil plant, for instance, might encompass an area of roughly 40 acres. This might sound substantial until one considers that with an average bombing accuracy of 3,000 feet, the destructive pattern of the dropped bombs would indiscriminately spread across a staggering 300 acres. In essence, the operation devolved into a desperate form of carpet bombing, with crews reduced to fervently praying that something of strategic importance might inadvertently be struck. The profound human cost exacerbated an already dire situation, rendering it even more harrowing. Each perilous mission demanded that 10-man crews navigate through veritable walls of flak, those ominous, billowing black puffs of exploding 88mm shells that possessed the terrifying capacity to shred a bomber's robust aluminum skin as effortlessly as if it were fragile tissue paper. The survival rates for bomber crews in 1943 were nothing short of terrifying. Statistically, a bomber crew faced a grim 1 in 4 probability of completing their mandatory 25 missions. And for what ultimate purpose? To witness their bombs vanish into obscuring clouds, or, even worse, to observe them strike, knowing full well they had just obliterated a civilian residential block, while the critical factory next door continued its operations unimpeded. Morale among the airmen was plummeting at an alarming rate, arguably even faster than the bombing campaign itself was failing to achieve its strategic objectives. The Norden bomb sight was heralded as the revolutionary device poised to fundamentally alter the course of aerial warfare. For those who have pondered why American bombers steadfastly adhered to their suicidal daylight missions, while their British counterparts, with pragmatic wisdom, transitioned to the relative safety of night bombing, the Norden provides the definitive answer. This intricate instrument, officially designated the Mark 15 Norden bomb sight, was essentially a sophisticated mechanical analog computer. Weighing a substantial 50 pounds and commanding an exorbitant price of $8,000 per unit in 1943, an amount exceeding the cost of most houses at the time, it represented an immense investment. The Army Air Forces harbored an almost obsessive devotion to this device, committing an astonishing $1.5 billion to its development and production, thereby establishing it as one of America's most expensive and ambitious weapons programs. For a telling comparison, the entirety of the clandestine Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, cost a comparatively modest $2 billion. Carl Norden, a brilliant Swiss engineer residing in New York, had conceived and designed this optical computing marvel back in the 1920s, basing it on a truly ingenious concept. The bombardier would position himself in the aircraft's nose, meticulously peering through the sight's eyepiece, manually tracking the designated target. Simultaneously, the bomb sight's intricate mechanisms would automatically compute crucial variables such as wind drift, altitude, airspeed, and the bomb's projected trajectory. The sophistication of the device was further enhanced by a remarkable integration, The sight was directly wired into the aircraft's autopilot system. During the critical bombing run, the bombardier possessed the capability to make precise corrections using a dedicated control panel. In response, the bomb sight would then physically manipulate the aircraft's flight controls, steering the plane with exquisite precision to counteract any wind drift. Theoretically, this innovative system promised an almost mythical picklebarrel accuracy. Army demonstrations, conducted under ideal conditions, showcased bombardiers effortlessly dropping practice bombs into tight 100-foot circles from an altitude of 20,000 feet. Promotional materials, with an audacious confidence, literally asserted that the Norden could enable a bombardier to drop a bomb directly into a pickle barrel from 4 miles above the Earth. The security protocols surrounding the Norden bomb sites were characterized by an almost pathological paranoia. Bombardiers were compelled to take a solemn, formal oath, entirely separate from their standard military allegiance, swearing never to divulge any information whatsoever about the highly classified device. Before each and every mission, an armed guard would personally transport the precious bomb sight to the aircraft, securely encased within a locked container. In the dire event of a bomber being shot down, bombardiers were issued explicit, unyielding orders. They were to destroy the site with a thermite grenade before attempting to bail out. Tragically, several bombardiers lost their lives attempting to comply with these stringent directives, remaining with their burning aircraft for dangerously extended periods, while desperately endeavoring to melt their Norden sights into an unrecognizable slag. The military genuinely held the profound conviction that if a single Norden fell into German hands, it would be swiftly copied, and America's perceived strategic advantage would, in their estimation, vanish overnight. Herein lay the crushing irony, a stark revelation that undermined years of meticulous secrecy and immense investment. The Germans had already acquired the Norden's closely guarded secrets and, remarkably, chose to disregard them. A German spy named Hermann Lang had successfully pilfered the complete blueprints back in 1938. However, upon reviewing the designs, German engineers merely shrugged, unimpressed, and returned to their own indigenous Lotferrohr 7 bomb sight project. The reason for their indifference was profoundly simple. They had already independently deduced what American aircrews were about to learn through bitter, hard-won experience. The Norden's vaunted precision was entirely theoretical, predicated upon a set of idealized conditions. It assumed that a bomber would have unlimited time over the target, encounter absolutely no defensive fire, enjoy perfect visibility, and operate in perfectly stable air. The brutal realities of combat over Europe, however, offered precisely none of these crucial prerequisites. The initial, stark confrontation with reality emerged directly from the very nature of the targets themselves. German factory complexes were not passive, defenseless targets situated in open, unobstructed fields. Instead, they were equipped with sophisticated smoke generators, capable of deploying a dense, obscuring blanket of artificial fog across entire industrial zones within a mere 5 minutes of an alarm being sounded. By late 1943, German defensive doctrine mandated that every major strategic target possess sufficient smoke-generating capacity to completely obscure visibility for a full 30 minutes. Bombardiers would meticulously spend their entire approach watching their target, clearly visible and seemingly within reach. Then, at the most critical juncture, with a sudden, almost theatrical poof, the target would vanish entirely, subsumed beneath an impenetrable shroud of artificial fog. At this point, the bombardier was reduced to mere guesswork, a task for which the technologically advanced Norden bomb sight was utterly incapable of computing a best guess. Beyond the static defenses, the very dynamics of aerial combat presented another insurmountable challenge. The Norden bomb sight demanded a perfectly straight and level bombing run of at least 3 minutes to accurately compute its calculations. However, committing to 3 minutes of flying straight and level over the heavily defended airspace of Germany was tantamount to deliberately presenting oneself as a predictable and vulnerable target for every single flak gun below. Pilots quickly and painfully learned that undertaking evasive action, though essential for survival, rendered the Norden bomb sight completely useless. The sophisticated device simply could not compensate for sudden changes in altitude or sharp, defensive turns. Consequently, aircrews found themselves trapped in an agonizing, impossible choice: either fly steadily and face almost certain death, or maneuver aggressively and inevitably miss their target. German flak gunners were engaged in far more than just merely shooting at American bombers. They were executing what could only be described as an industrial-scale annihilation. By 1943, Germany had meticulously constructed the most intricate and formidable anti-aircraft defense network ever conceived in human history, a system that was systematically and ruthlessly shredding the valiant 8th Air Force. The formidable backbone of this devastating system was the iconic 88mm flak gun, correctly identified as the Flak 18/36/37, depending on its specific variant. While many are familiar with the 88's fearsome reputation as a tank killer, which it certainly was, its primary and most deadly function was the systematic destruction of bombers. Germany produced an astonishing approximate total of 21,000 of these potent guns throughout the war, with roughly 10,000 of them strategically positioned, forming an impenetrable ring around vital targets across occupied Europe. What rendered the 88mm gun so utterly terrifying was its devastating capability. It could propel a potent 20-pound high-explosive shell to an astonishing altitude of up to 32,000 feet, all at a rapid and relentless rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Each of these formidable shells was meticulously fitted with a time delay fuse, which German crews would precisely set by hand, calibrating it specifically to the estimated altitude of the approaching bomber formation. The shell would then ascend with incredible velocity, reach its predetermined detonation height, and then explode into thousands of razor-sharp fragments, hurtling outwards at supersonic speeds. A single, seemingly innocuous fragment, no larger than a human thumb, possessed the terrifying power to effortlessly punch through a bomber's aluminum skin, sever critical control cables, rupture vital fuel tanks, or instantly kill a crew member, transforming a mission into a sudden, catastrophic nightmare. Moreover, German gunners were not operating in isolation, firing individual rounds. They were meticulously coordinated, unleashing their devastating firepower in synchronized batteries. A typical German industrial target, such as those found in the heavily fortified Ruhr Valley, would be defended by an array of 40 to 60 heavy flak guns, strategically positioned to create overlapping and mutually supporting fields of fire. Advanced fire control radar systems, specifically the sophisticated Würzburg system, possessed the capability to track incoming bomber formations from an impressive distance of 44 miles out, continuously feeding precise data to interconnected gun calculators. The Germans had, in essence, integrated mechanical computers at each battery, which would rapidly crunch complex data pertaining to the bomber's altitude, speed, and heading. These sophisticated machines would then instantaneously spit out precise firing solutions, allowing the crews to set their fuses and commence firing their deadly ordnance even before the American bombers had visually acquired their intended target. Even as the relentless onslaught of anti-aircraft fire raged, the bomber crews sometimes managed to visually acquire their designated targets. During a substantial aerial offensive, It was not uncommon for hundreds of formidable anti-aircraft guns to unleash thousands upon thousands of shells, thereby creating what the bomber personnel grimly referred to as flak fields. These were vast expanses of the sky that would visibly transform into an opaque, ebony canvas due to the sheer density of the explosions. The underlying arithmetic of this aerial combat was stark and unforgiving. If an aircraft navigated through intense flak at an altitude of 18,000 feet, it found itself squarely within the optimal engagement zone where German artillery exhibited its most lethal precision. At such an elevated position, flight crews vividly recounted encountering flak bursts so numerous and concentrated that they completely obstructed visibility. The accompanying auditory experience was likened to being confined within a hollow metal drum, while someone vigorously assailed it with hammers. Survivors later articulated the sound as a continuous, reverberating thunder, interspersed with the distinct, metallic ping of shrapnel impacting the aircraft's fuselage. Navigator John Morris, a member of the 301st Bomb Group, recorded a harrowing entry in his personal journal following a mission targeting Bremen. "I meticulously counted 127 perforations in our aircraft. It remains a mystery how we managed to survive." Jenkins tragically succumbed to blood loss in the waist section before we even managed to traverse the English Channel. He was a mere 19 years of age. Consequently, American strategic planners arrived at what appeared to be a rational and judicious decision to ascend to greater heights. By the middle of 1943, bomber formations were routinely conducting their operations at altitudes ranging from 25,000 to 27,000 feet, occasionally even venturing upwards to 30,000 feet. At these extreme elevations, aircraft were positioned above the effective operational ceiling of the majority of the flak, and German fighter aircraft encountered considerable difficulties in maintaining optimal performance at such rarefied atmospheric conditions. The inherent complication, however, was that at 25,000 feet, the ambient air temperature plummeted to a frigid -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the atmosphere became so attenuated that even with the aid of supercharged engines, aircraft performance inevitably deteriorated. Flight crews were compelled to utilize specialized heated flight suits and oxygen masks simply to ensure their survival. Yet, the most profound detriment was the catastrophic effect that extreme altitude had on bombing accuracy. One must recall the much-vaunted Norden bomb sight, which had promised picklebarrel precision. At 25,000 feet, every single variable that had rendered bombing a formidable challenge at 18,000 feet became exponentially more problematic. High-altitude wind velocities were not merely the 20 or 30 miles per hour encountered at lower atmospheric strata. They frequently reached astonishing speeds of 80, 100, and on occasion, even 120 miles per hour. The very concept of jet streams was, at this juncture, not yet comprehensively understood. Crews simply observed that at times, after releasing their ordnance, they would watch the bombs drift laterally for several miles from their intended trajectory. Furthermore, visual acuity became inherently unreliable. Clouds that appeared diaphanous and insubstantial from an elevated perspective would completely occlude the targets below. Temperature inversions within the atmosphere created distinct layers that refracted and bent light, rendering accurate target sighting virtually impossible. The innovative technique of offset bombing was not a premeditated strategy. Rather, it emerged from a crucible of desperation, profound confusion, and a singular navigational miscalculation during a mission over Schweinfurt in October 1943. The second major assault on Schweinfurt's critical ball-bearing manufacturing facilities had already devolved into an unmitigated catastrophe. From a total of 291 bombers launched, a staggering 60 were shot down, and an additional 17 sustained such extensive damage that they were permanently grounded. This represented an appalling loss rate of 26% in the course of a single operational sortie. However, nestled within the voluminous post-mission reports was an intriguing anomaly. One particular bomb group, the 305th, had inadvertently approached their initial point, the precise geographical location from which the final bombing run commenced, from an incorrect bearing. Instead of adhering to the predetermined north-to-south attack vector, they had approached from the northeast, at an approximate 40-degree angle relative to the target. Their navigator, Captain Robert Williams, had erroneously miscalculated a crucial wind correction during the approach phase. By the time the lead pilot became cognizant of their deviation from the planned course, the formation was already irrevocably committed. It was simply not feasible to execute an abrupt turn with a formation comprising 18 heavy bombers, particularly when confronted by swarms of aggressive German fighter aircraft. In response to this unforeseen predicament, Williams made a critical decision in the field. He instructed his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, to utilize the crosswind correction knobs on the northern sight, but with a deliberate modification, to intentionally offset the aiming point to the right of the primary factory complex. Essentially, instead of aiming directly at the target and allowing the bomb sight to compute the drift, Murphy aimed at an unoccupied expanse of ground adjacent to the target, and then permitted the bombs to drift back into the intended area. The outcomes of this unconventional approach were meticulously documented by the strike cameras affixed to every bomber. While the majority of other groups on that fateful day achieved their typical hit rates, which ranged between 8% and 12%, the bombs released by the 305th Group walked directly through the very core of the factory complex. An astonishing 42% of their ordnance impacted within the designated target area. Initially, analytical experts presumed this remarkable accuracy was merely a stroke of luck, a random fortuitous occurrence. However, Williams adamantly maintained that it was anything but random, and he possessed the mathematical evidence to substantiate his assertion. It became clear that the Norden bomb sight possessed a fundamental design assumption that was severely compromising accuracy at high altitudes. It presupposed that the aircraft would be flying directly towards its target, with the wind either propelling it forward or retarding its progress, a perfect headwind or tailwind scenario. The sight's drift correction mechanism was engineered to account for precisely this. Nevertheless, at 25,000 feet over Germany, the winds were almost never perfectly aligned with the bombing run. They invariably originated from the side, exerting a lateral force that pushed the entire aircraft sideways through the air. This lateral wind phenomenon created what is technically known as a crab angle. The aircraft's nose would be oriented slightly into the prevailing wind direction to maintain a straight ground track, much like a person walking forward while leaning into a powerful side wind. The inherent difficulty arose when bombs were released from an aircraft flying at a crab angle. They inherited both the forward velocity and the concurrent sideways drift. The Norden bomb sight was exceptionally adept at calculating the forward trajectory, but its lateral drift compensation assumed the aircraft was maintaining a heading directly towards the target. When this was not the case, when the aircraft was crabbing into a crosswind, the sight's calculations were erroneous by hundreds of feet. The greater the intensity of the crosswind, the more pronounced the error. And at 25,000 feet, robust crosswinds were an almost constant factor. Williams' serendipitous discovery was elegantly simple yet profoundly revolutionary. If one deliberately approached the target at an angle to the anticipated wind direction and simultaneously offset the aim point perpendicular to the flight path, it became possible to harness the crosswind to precisely guide the bombs onto the target. Instead of expending effort to counteract the wind's drift, It was effectively weaponized. The bombardier would identify a specific reference point, perhaps a road intersection, a distinctive bend in a river, or a prominent building that was situated directly crosswind from the actual target. He would then meticulously aim at this chosen reference point, and as the bombs descended through 4 miles of atmospheric space, the wind would predictably propel them sideways onto the real target. The brilliance of this method lay in its geometric precision. At an offset angle of 40 to 50 degrees, the wind performed the majority of the work. The bombs would drift in a highly predictable manner, and because this drift was accounted for from the very beginning of the process, the dispersion pattern of the ordnance tightened dramatically. Instead of bombs scattering in an elongated oval shape along the aircraft's flight path, they would track laterally in a concentrated, precise line. This technique was undeniably counterintuitive. It involved intentionally aiming away from the intended point of impact. Yet, the underlying physics were irrefutable. The mathematical principles underpinning offset bombing were not overly complex, but they necessitated a complete reevaluation by bombardiers of their approach to the problem. Conventional bombing doctrine dictated, aim directly at the target and allow the Norden to compute all other variables. Offset bombing, conversely, advocated, temporarily disregard the existence of the target. Concentrate instead on the wind triangle. Every bombardier had been instructed in the principles of wind triangles during their navigation schooling, but for many, these were largely regarded as theoretical exercises. Now, these very same triangles represented the critical distinction between successfully striking a factory and inadvertently obliterating a hospital 3 city blocks distant. To elucidate the practical application of this mathematics, consider the following scenario. Imagine an aircraft flying at an altitude of 25,000 feet with a ground speed of 180 miles per hour and a persistent 90-mile-per-hour crosswind blowing from west to east. The bombs would require approximately 60 seconds to fall from their release point to impact. This equates to a full minute of crucial drift time. During this minute, the bomb's forward momentum would carry them approximately 3 miles along the aircraft's flight path. However, that powerful crosswind would simultaneously push them sideways at 90 miles per hour, resulting in a lateral drift of 1.5 miles. Without the implementation of offset correction, aiming at the factory would result in the bombs landing 1.5 miles to the east, impacting whatever structures happened to be situated there. The offset solution ingeniously inverted this equation. Instead of flying directly towards the factory, the aircraft would approach at a 40 to 50 degree angle from the west, with the wind on its left side actively pushing it towards the target. The bombardier would then identify an offset aiming point, for instance, a railroad yard situated precisely where the wind would carry the bombs from. He would meticulously track that railroad yard through the Norden bomb site, input the calculated crosswind drift angle into the computer, and initiate the release sequence. The bombs would detach from the aircraft, commence their descent, and the prevailing crosswind would then propel them from the railroad yard towards the factory. If the calculations were performed with accuracy, the bombs would arrive at the factory precisely as they made contact with the ground. The precise measurement of wind speed became an absolutely paramount factor, and it was in this area that significant advancements were made. Navigators began employing a sophisticated technique known as the double drift method during the bomb run approach. They would record 2 distinct drift readings at separate points along the trajectory towards the target, essentially quantifying the extent to which the wind was diverting the aircraft from its intended course. By meticulously comparing these 2 readings, they were able to ascertain the wind speed and direction with remarkable accuracy. Highly skilled navigators could acquire wind data that was within 5 miles per hour of the actual atmospheric conditions, and this level of precision proved sufficient to ensure the efficacy of offset bombing. The resultant enhancement in bombing accuracy was truly astonishing. Testing conducted by the 8th Air Force in late 1943 demonstrated that offset approaches, executed at 45-degree angles, reduced the circular error probable, CP, from 3,200 feet down to approximately 1,100 feet. This figure was almost precisely the 1,000-foot threshold that strategic planners had initially demanded. Some particularly proficient bombardier navigator teams were even achieving an accuracy of 800 feet on days with clear visibility. While this might not appear especially impressive when compared to contemporary GPS-guided munitions that can land within 15 feet of their target, in 1943, it constituted a revolutionary breakthrough. It signified that the bombs were, in fact, striking within the confines of the factory complex itself, rather than merely scattering across the surrounding rural landscape. Dominating the surrounding rural landscape. This sophisticated aerial bombardment method necessitated a synergistic effort and precision synchronicity among three vital crew members: the navigator, the bombardier, and the pilot. The navigator bore the critical responsibility of accurately determining intricate wind calculations and pinpointing the precise offset reference point. The bombardier, in turn, was required to fully commit to these calculations, diligently tracking a designated reference marker even as his deep-seated instincts vociferously contradicted his training, insisting it was not the true objective. Simultaneously, the pilot faced the formidable challenge of maintaining an unswerving heading and an exact altitude, all while anti-aircraft fire erupted violently around his aircraft, and a primal urge compelled him to maneuver defensively. A solitary misstep within this intricate operational chain would inevitably revert their mission to an indiscriminate ordnance delivery. The most significant constraint to widespread implementation, however, quickly emerged as training. Bombardiers, having dedicated numerous months to mastering the art of aiming directly at their intended targets, now faced the arduous task of eradicating the deeply ingrained habit. This cognitive reprogramming was akin to instructing a seasoned basketball player to focus on the backboard rather than the hoop itself, a fundamental shift that provoked intense mental resistance at every stage. To address this formidable challenge, the Army Air Forces established dedicated training academies in Florida and Arizona. Here, aircrews diligently practiced offset bombing runs over simulated enemy industrial complexes, meticulously flying the prescribed patterns dozens of times until the complex spatial relationships and geometric principles became second nature. The gravity of the situation was further underscored by the decision to recall even veteran crews, those who had already distinguished themselves in combat missions, back to England for this specialized retraining, a clear testament to the High Command's profound commitment to this new methodology. By January 1944, the 8th Air Force found itself grappling with an enviable predicament, a dilemma born of success that most organizations would eagerly covet. They had, against considerable odds, uncovered a genuinely effective operational paradigm. The subsequent challenge lay in disseminating this critical operational capability among a vast contingent of 12,000 personnel deployed across 40 distinct airfields throughout England, all while simultaneously engaged in ongoing, intense wartime operations. General James Doolittle, assuming command of the 8th Air Force in January, meticulously reviewed the compelling offset bombing data and promptly elevated its mastery to his foremost educational imperative. He then issued a formidable directive to his operations officer, Brigadier General Fred Anderson, granting him a mere 6 weeks to comprehensively retrain every bombardier and navigator within the entire theater of operations. Anderson's initial response was famously an expletive-laden outburst, yet he nevertheless accomplished the formidable task. The extensive retraining initiative commenced with the vanguard formations, specifically targeting the most seasoned bombardiers and navigators, who occupied the foremost positions in each aerial grouping. These individuals served as the operational benchmark for all other crews, making their early and complete proficiency in the nuanced offset methodologies absolutely paramount. Consequently, dedicated training centers were instituted at every bomber base, employing a comprehensive pedagogical approach that combined rigorous didactic sessions with extensive hands-on aerial exercises conducted over the challenging English coastal ranges. The theoretical curriculum meticulously delved into the complex principles of wind triangles, drift calculations, and offset geometry, ensuring that crews internalized these concepts to such a degree that they could perform the intricate calculations with unconscious competence. Following this foundational academic phase, the practical flying component began. The inherent difficulty, however, stemmed from the exceptionally adverse training environment presented by England during the winter months. Persistent atmospheric opacity was a constant feature. Erratic and fluctuating air currents rendered wind predictions notoriously challenging, and restricted periods of natural illumination severely curtailed training windows. Yet, in a counterintuitively advantageous manner, these very impediments served to strengthen the crews. The logic was clear. If proficiency could be achieved in hitting targets amidst the formidable English weather, then the conditions likely to be encountered over Germany would prove significantly less daunting. Consequently, crews would depart at first light, navigating to maritime ordnance delivery zones situated off the coast, where they would execute numerous offset practice runs against designated floating targets or obsolete, derelict vessels. Each crew undertook at least 3 preparatory sorties before receiving certification for combat offset bombing, though some required as many as 10 before they developed a visceral understanding of the technique. A pivotal factor in the success of this retraining was the instructional model itself. Seasoned frontline personnel were mentoring their peers. This was decidedly not the instruction of a dispassionate academician with theoretical diagrams and a pointer. Rather, it was Lieutenant Murphy from the 305th Bomb Group, the individual who had serendipitously stumbled upon the offset methodology at Schweinfurt, standing in a freezing Quonset hut, meticulously demonstrating his exact procedures to fellow bombardiers. Concurrently, Captain Williams expertly guided navigators through his refined meteorological computations, utilizing actual mission data to illustrate his wind calculation methods. When students grappled with the inherent paradox of aiming away from their intended targets, instructors would present compelling strike camera footage from recent engagements, vividly contrasting the outcomes. Here is traditional bombing achieving a mere 9% accuracy. Here is offset achieving a remarkable 38%. The incontrovertibly compelling evidence silenced all skepticism. Concurrently with the intensive training, strategic operational directives were revised. The 8th Air Force comprehensively revised their tactical bombing manuals in February 1944, and Field Order 259, formally sanctioned on February 20th, officially authorized the adoption of offset bombing approaches for all missions where lateral air currents surpassed the 40-mile-per-hour threshold. Group commanders were furnished with comprehensive operational dossiers that meticulously outlined the most advantageous attack vectors for every strategically significant German objective. For instance, specific flight paths were advised for Schweinfurt, recommending approaches from the northeast at a 45-degree angle. Similarly, the industrial installations of the Ruhr Valley yielded superior results when attacked with 50-degree offsets originating from the west. This level of meticulous preparation was indicative of exhaustive preliminary analysis, clearly demonstrating that considerable homework had been thoroughly completed. The actual implementation, however, encountered considerable friction. More seasoned aviators, particularly those who had endured the brutal campaigns of 1943, demonstrated staunch opposition to altering established methodologies that they had quite literally paid a grievous price in blood and sacrifice to master. A notable occurrence from March 1944 vividly illustrates this resistance. A pilot from the 91st Bomb Group adamantly declined to execute the prescribed offset maneuver during an approach to Brunswick, insisting instead on the conventional direct assault, reasoning that, "That's how we've always done it." His bombardier subsequently failed to strike the objective by a significant margin of half a mile, and that pilot was promptly and discreetly transitioned to roles outside of direct operational engagement. General Doolittle's resolve on this matter was unyielding, encapsulated in his stark ultimatum: "Adapt or get out of the way." By April 1944, offset bombing had been fully integrated as the established protocol for aerial bombardment. Mission briefings now incorporated specialized meteorological assessments, where dedicated meteorologists would furnish crews with anticipated atmospheric velocities and vectors at bombing altitude. Navigators, in turn, received precomputed directional alignments for offset attacks, meticulously formulated based on the projected atmospheric conditions. Should environmental parameters shift en route, navigators were equipped with readily accessible reference charts, enabling immediate in-flight adjustments and recalculations. The entire system was becoming meticulously formalized and integrated, a development that signified even crews of moderate proficiency could now attain levels of accuracy previously reserved for only the most extraordinarily talented individuals. The tangible outcomes were instantaneously reflected in the operational metrics. By March 1944, the precision of ordnance delivery had surged, with bombing accuracy demonstrating a mean circular error of 1,250 feet across all 8th Air Force missions, a substantial 60% enhancement compared to December 1943. More significantly, the proportion of ordnance impacting designated target zones ascended dramatically, climbing from a mere 11% to an impressive 27%. While this still implied that a considerable 3/4 of the bombs failed to find their mark, it nonetheless represented a profound paradigm shift in operational efficacy. Industrial complexes that previously necessitated 4 or 5 raids for significant impairment could now be effectively incapacitated in just 2. D-Day, the monumental Allied invasion, presented offset bombing with its supreme crucible, and the geopolitical ramifications of its performance were immeasurable. On June 6, 1944, the fate of the colossal Normandy invasion hinged entirely upon the Allied bombers' capacity to obliterate the formidable German littoral defenses before ground troops made landfall on the beaches. These were far more than mere gun positions. They constituted heavily fortified concrete emplacements, boasting imposing 8-foot-thick walls, housing heavy ordnance capable of decimating amphibious assault vessels from a distance of 3 miles offshore. Intelligence reports had meticulously pinpointed 49 primary artillery installations distributed along a critical 50-mile stretch of coastline. Each and every one of these had to be rendered inoperable, lest myriads of servicemen perish amidst the tumultuous breakers. The 8th Air Force was assigned the critical task of supporting the landings at Utah and Omaha beaches. Their operational window was a precise 40-minute interval from 5:50 to 6:30 hours, during which they were mandated to deliver in excess of 2,900 tons of explosive ordnance upon defensive structures encompassing a cumulative area of under 2 square miles. The operational window was exceptionally unforgiving, as they would be executing strikes during the pre-dawn gloom, with atmospheric opacity predicted to range between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, while conventional operational tenets dictated the impossibility of precision bombing through obscured skies. Established tactical guidelines were on the verge of another radical revision. The innovative combination of offset bombing techniques with advanced radar navigation aids rendered it conceptually feasible to engage objectives entirely obscured from visual perception. This is how their audacious plan was conceived. Specialized Pathfinder aircraft, outfitted with H-2X ground mapping radar units, were designated to lead each formation. This sophisticated radar system possessed the capability to generate a rudimentary topographical representation of the littoral zone despite atmospheric obfuscation, primarily by discriminating the interface between terrestrial and aquatic environments. Navigators, leveraging this radar imagery, would then identify prominent geographical markers along the shoreline, such as estuaries, land projections, and curvilinear coastal contours, and utilize these as designated positional benchmarks for indirect targeting. The underlying mathematical principles applied were identical to those of visual offset bombing, with the crucial distinction that calculations were now performed using electronic echoes rather than direct visual assessment. Bombardiers were tasked with meticulously monitoring the designated radar benchmark, computing the atmospheric displacement that would propel ordnance from that specific point to the fortifications, and executing the release. The operational implementation on the morning of D-Day descended into disarray. Cloud cover proved significantly worse than forecast, manifesting as dense, unbroken cloud layers extending from 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet in numerous operational zones. Consequently, bomber formations were compelled to lower their operational altitude to 12,000 feet to penetrate beneath the most severe atmospheric conditions, an action that unfortunately exposed them to the defensive capabilities of any surviving German anti-aircraft artillery that had endured the preliminary maritime ordnance barrage. Furthermore, aerodynamic forces presented considerable challenges, with strong 25 to 40 miles per hour crosswinds originating from the northwest, actively propelling the aircraft closer to the landing zones. Paradoxically, this very atmospheric force was ingeniously repurposed as an offensive asset. At Omaha Beach, the bombing results were initially conveyed as catastrophically unsuccessful. The majority of ordnance impacted terrestrial areas further from the coast, creating significant depressions in agricultural lands and thoroughfares situated astern of the enemy emplacements. Subsequent forensic examination following the invasion indicated that a mere 31% of the defensive structures at Omaha sustained direct impacts during the aerial assault. However, the preliminary assessments overlooked a crucial detail. The indirect targeting methodologies employed at Utah Beach proved profoundly destructive. At Utah, bombardiers expertly employed a 45-degree angular deviation, executing their ingress from the northeast quadrant, with the prevailing lateral air currents precisely propelling them in the direction of the landing zone. The ordnance subsequently traversed the artillery emplacements with remarkable precision, forming distinct linear patterns of impact, effectively demolishing fortified shelters and incapacitating artillery installations with an 89% efficacy rate. Out of the 28 primary defensive structures identified at Utah Beach, an astounding 25 were rendered inoperative before the first waves of troops even made landfall. The stark divergence in outcomes between Omaha and Utah was fundamentally attributable to the meticulousness of their operational execution. At Omaha, bombardiers, overwhelmed by the apprehension of inadvertently striking friendly amphibious assault vessels, incorporated a conscious deferment in their ordnance deployment timing, retaining the bombs for a supplementary temporal interval of a few seconds. This decision consequently shifted the points of impact by 200 to 300 yards away from the shoreline, landing them inland. It was a commendable humanitarian impulse, yet one that yielded a disastrous outcome. Conversely, at Utah, bombardiers adhered precisely to their predetermined ordnance release coordinates, without any precautionary deferments, relying implicitly on the mathematical computations to ensure the ordnance avoided the landing zones. Their unwavering faith was validated when the 4th Infantry Division made landfall on Utah Beach at precisely 6:30 hours. They discovered the enemy emplacements had already been obliterated. Opposition proved negligible, and human losses were exceedingly few. Light, and casualties were minimal. The profound lessons learned were meticulously chronicled in a classified comprehensive assessment finalized in July 1944. It revealed that traditional straight-in bombing approaches, even those modified at Omaha for critical safety concerns, achieved a mere 31% operational success rate. In stark contrast, the offset approaches employed at Utah, executed precisely as trained, demonstrated an impressive 89% effectiveness. This was far from an insignificant gain. It represented the critical distinction between a technique that barely functioned and one that secured overwhelming victories in battle. The report definitively concluded that the implementation of offset bombing had drastically reduced the necessary operational sorties required to neutralize fortified enemy positions by a substantial factor of 3. By the summer of 1944, every major Allied aerial bombardment operation had seamlessly integrated offset techniques as a fundamental operational dogma. This innovative methodology became the standard procedure for critical missions such as the relentless dismantling of French rail yards preceding the invasion, the precision attacks on the menacing V-1 launch sites, and the systematic destruction of Germany's vital oil production facilities. The technique's influence even transcended inter-service distinctions. The 9th Air Force's medium bombers swiftly adopted it for their tactical strikes, while even RAF Bomber Command, which had initially scoffed at American precision bombing as an impractical pipe dream, began cautiously experimenting with offset methods for their own daylight operations. The desperate ingenuity born over Schweinfurt in 1943 did not merely conclude with the cessation of World War II, it profoundly reshaped the conceptual framework for how humanity approached the deployment of ordnance from aircraft. Following the cessation of hostilities, when post-conflict assessors compiled the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, they unearthed an astonishing revelation within the statistical evidence. Between January and December 1944, as offset bombing became ubiquitous across the 8th Air Force, the overall payload delivered upon Germany experienced a staggering 340% surge, while precision sharpened by an impressive 190%. This meant a dual advantage: more bombs were being released, and a significantly higher proportion of them were hitting their intended targets. This potent combination shattered the backbone of German manufacturing capabilities in ways that the indiscriminate early war bombardments never could have achieved. The advent of the Cold War transformed offset techniques from an operational exigency into a foundational pillar of strategic methodology. As the Air Force commenced planning for potential nuclear strikes in the 1950s, precision transformed into a matter of ultimate survival. A conventional bomb that deviates by a mile merely squanders valuable assets. However, a nuclear weapon that misses by the same margin could catastrophically impact unintended urban centers. Consequently, Air Force bombing schools began teaching offset geometry as an indispensable tenet of instruction, equally critical as mastering basic flight maneuvers like taking off and landing. Every bomber pilot within Strategic Air Command could instinctively compute offset angles with effortless proficiency, as their rigorous training assumed they would be delivering atomic weapons through formidable Soviet air defenses, where straight-in approaches guaranteed fatal consequences. The underlying mathematical principles progressed in tandem with technological innovation. When the iconic B-52 Stratofortress entered service in 1955, it was equipped with advanced radar bombing systems that fundamentally served as self-operating offset computation devices. The N/ASQ-38 bombing navigation system possessed the sophisticated capability to identify discernible radar signatures, accurately calculate wind drift, determine optimal offset angles, and autonomously execute the bombing approach. The bombardier's role thus transitioned from laborious manual computation to vigilant system oversight, yet the foundational concept remained Robert Williams's serendipitous revelation: to harness atmospheric currents as a weapon rather than futilely contending against them. The Vietnam War unequivocally proved that offset bombing remained effective in an entirely different operational environment. The monsoon winds over North Vietnam were tempestuous and erratic, presenting meteorological challenges far more formidable than those encountered over European skies. B-52 formations engaged in bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail would approach their targets at offset angles meticulously calculated from contemporaneous atmospheric data gathered by specialized weather reconnaissance aircraft. They were deploying ordnance from 30,000 feet through winds that sometimes surpassed velocities of 150 miles per hour, yet still achieved a level of precision that made the disruption of supply routes remarkably successful. Post-strike reconnaissance confirmed that arc-light missions, the code name for these B-52 raids, exhibited an average circular error probable (CP) of under 1,500 feet. These formidable operational circumstances eventually ushered in the era of precision-guided munitions (PGMs), which appeared to render the offset bombing methodology antiquated. The logical question arose: why engage in intricate aerodynamic computations when one could deploy a laser-guided bomb that autonomously adjusted its trajectory? The first Gulf War in 1991 dramatically showcased the astounding capability of munitions to navigate with pinpoint accuracy, even through minuscule openings like ventilation shafts, leading strategic commentators to confidently proclaim the epoch of meticulously computed aerial attacks concluded. Computers and GPS, they believed, would manage all operational requirements henceforth. However, this assertion proved to be fundamentally erroneous, for they neglected to account for the pervasive threat of electronic countermeasures. Modern air defenses do not merely engage aerial platforms kinetically. They actively disrupt satellite navigation transmissions, deceptively manipulate aiming mechanisms, and create sophisticated electronic environments where precision weapons revert to an unguided state. When GPS is actively jammed, military aviators find themselves reverted to the elemental challenge of 1943. How does one accurately strike a target when advanced technological apparatus becomes inoperable? The answer, which the modern Air Force has profoundly reaffirmed, is offset bombing. Contemporary operational guidelines for satellite navigation-deprived operational zones instruct bomber crews to utilize radar-identifiable features as offset reference points, personally compute atmospheric currents, and deploy ordnance through geometric principles rather than reliance on orbital assets. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, widely considered the pinnacle of aerospace engineering, has offset bombing calculations integrated inherently within its operational programming, not merely as a contingency, but as a fundamental strategic choice for specific mission scenarios. When infiltrating hostile, fortified air territories, where employing active targeting systems would jeopardize clandestine operational integrity, passive offset techniques allow for attacks without emitting detectable electronic signatures. Crews identify reference points using advanced synthetic aperture radar systems, calculate the precise offset angle that harnesses atmospheric currents to one's advantage, release weapons, and then depart. The adversary remains oblivious to your presence until the bombs commence their devastating explosions. Even unmanned aerial vehicle operations also incorporate offset methodologies. Operators of Reaper and Predator drones, when contending with powerful atmospheric currents at elevated elevations, will sometimes utilize displaced targeting coordinates for Hellfire missile attacks. While the weapon's internal guidance mechanism manages the terminal phase of its trajectory, the preliminary launch parameters employ offset geometry to position the ordnance within the general vicinity of the target. This approach is both expeditious and demonstrably more economical in terms of propellant consumption than requiring the missile to contend against crosswinds for its entire flight. The technique has thus returned to its foundational premise: necessity catalyzing ingenuity. Modern military planners, actively preparing for potential conflicts with militarily equivalent competitors, operate under the presumption of compromised or inaccessible satellite navigation. Consequently, they are training crews on manual offset bombing with a fervor unmatched since the pivotal year of 1944. Flight schools are diligently reinstructing in the intricate geometry of atmospheric vectors, and bombing ranges are conducting extensive drills in offset trajectory maneuvers. Someone within the Pentagon evidently reviewed the post-operational assessments pertaining to the D-Day landings and discerned the enduring efficacy of established methodologies in scenarios where contemporary systems falter. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy could scarcely have envisioned that their navigation error would shape military engagements 8 decades hence. Yet, that is precisely how real innovation functions. It resolves a pressing challenge with such profound ingenuity that its adoption becomes immutable. Dropping bombs sideways and allowing the wind to perform its work transcended the confines of a mere World War II stratagem. It represented a profound conceptual breakthrough into the realms of physics, geometry, and the art of transforming ambient atmospheric phenomena into potent instruments of conflict. Each meticulously executed aerial bombardment across the globe in the present era, whether guided by GPS or manually calculated, bears an indelible debt to that disoriented October dawn above Schweinfurt when someone misdirected their ordnance at an incorrect objective, yet fortuitously struck the intended one.